Jamie thought it was a scratch at first, the little spidery mark at the base of his ribcage. It wasn't until it started spreading that he realized it was scar tissue, twisted and ropey, stretching across his belly, and it wasn't until the next day that he realized it was spelling words. You have been warned. You have been warned. You have been warned.
PseudoPod, episode 806 for April 15th, 2022. Garden Empire by Christopher Mattson. Hey there, I'm Scott Campbell, Associate Editor, Web Wrangler, and your guest host for today's PseudoPod original story, Garden Empire by Christopher Mattson. Chris Mattson writes fiction and screenplays and has worked in film and television production for companies including Magnolia Pictures, HBO, and Netflix. He grew up in New Zealand, has lived in London and New York, and currently splits his time between Los Angeles and a section of regenerating native forest in New Zealand, where he tries not to get too involved with the local insect community. Your reader is Dan Rabatz. He is the author of the grimdark steampunk madcap fantasy novel Brothers of the Knife, first in the Children of Bane series, and co-authors the supernatural tech-noir crime thriller series The Path of Ra with Lee Murray. He narrates stories for Tales to Terrify and Beneath Ceaseless Skies, and hides on the web at dan.rabatz.com. A trigger warning. This story has insects. Like, a lot of insects. So if that bothers you, feel free to skip this episode. You thought I was going to say bug you. I wouldn't be that cruel. I mean, I work for a horror podcast, but I have standards. Now, listen to the buzzing, the chirping, and the trilling, for it has a story for you, and it promises it's true.
Garden Empire by Christopher Mattson. Narrated by Dan Rabatz. I'd bought the house only the week before, when I was still in possession both of my teeth and of my job as the head of machine learning for an Auckland-based startup. A 2-story villa with a section of native bush so dense that it baffled the city noise into a confused murmur. After David called and told me I was being pushed out, I stood in the second-floor kitchen with my forehead pressed against the picture window. A strand of bougainvillea vine bobbed in the garden below, and in my abstracted state it occurred to me that I had not fully explored the garden since moving in. I stepped around the shattered phone and walked downstairs. The outside assembled itself around me in bands of decreasing light and temperature. Through the roasting vault of vertical sunlight hugging the wall of the house, underneath the sharp sliced shadows cast by the Nikau palm border, and into the cool, mottled heart. I manoeuvred through a stand of tree ferns, and located the point where the vine snaked up a kowhai tree into a static explosion of flowers. I hoisted myself up through the branches, taking care to avoid the vine's vicious thorns. The back of the house hoved into view. From up in the kitchen, the canopy of the garden had seemed regular, like an organic carpet. But from my current position, muscles pleasantly stretching, there was no regularity at all, only a confusion of branches and leaves and grasping vines, and me, suspended like a monstrous, limbed fruit. A tiger stripe of cloud slid across the kitchen window pane, revealing my coffee cup on the sill. I stretched up for a better look, causing the flowers to shudder and dip. A dislocation swelled in my mind. I imagined myself in the kitchen moments before, sipping my coffee, noticing the dipping flowers and walking downstairs, this time to lock the door against unwanted visitors. My balance seemed to invert in a moment of panicked vertigo. I shifted my grip on the vine and drove a woody thorn clear through the webbing between finger and thumb. I bit off a cry and hopped backwards onto nothing. I landed heavily on my back next to a lavender bush. As I lay stunned, a bumblebee clambered about the clusters of purple throats. The bee's bulbous shape evoked the image of a furred brain. That was my brain, I thought, seeking out nutritious data. But where did the bee feed if the lavender sickened and died? Would it throb unhappily to the dark corners of the garden, to dine on sullen fungal growths, or the entrails of a dead mouse? My mind's eye would not hold the bee's gentle fur in the same scope as the mouse's cadaver, and the bee flickered into a fat black fly, and the fly multiplied into a swarm. Bees, entrails, flies. Mother had always warned me to be on guard against unhealthy mental progressions. As the bumblebee launched itself from the stalk with fumbling desperation, I realized that while unemployed, David's poisonous murmur, the splintering phone, I would need something to occupy my teeming mind. I needed a hobby. As my body reported the glad tidings of no piercings or breakage, I watched an ant descend the lavender mace that the bee had departed. On a whim, I followed it on an odyssey that descended the lavender bush, traversed a rotten log pregnant with fungus, and terminated brutally at the shore of a small rivulet, where it was overwhelmed and dismembered by a battalion of other ants, presumably from a rival nest. As two of its antagonists clamped its straining body in place while a third snicked its head from its thorax, I began to shiver, and was astonished to find that the sun had disappeared behind the house. I had been in the garden for several hours. I ascended and spent the rest of the day poring over an entomology monograph that had somehow migrated from Mother's library. The next morning, I armed myself with a flask of coffee and a magnifying glass, and made my way down the dew-spangled steps. How to describe that magnificent day and the cascade that followed? A return to potent childhood memories of fingers probing soft earth in search of the robotic cicada larvae, eyes searching for the moth's wings like crayon rubbed over bark. I witnessed matings, births, a cornucopia of deaths, from the intimate assassin's sliding sting through thorax, to clashing armies of alien knights wielding chitinous swords and cellulose shields. I thrilled to it all, staying out later and later in order to examine those creatures who spend the day snug under fallen logs or slipped tight between bark and trunk. The more I observed and read about their methods of communication, semaphore, pheromones, others still impenetrable to human study, the more intrigued I became. Recent research posited the insect colony as a type of neural network, supremely efficient and able somehow to retain colonial memories beyond its constituent individuals. The equivalencies to machine learning protocols were obvious, and in my wilder moments I lost myself in fantasies of a career comeback based on the use of insect colonies as sample controls. I began to travel to the entomology wing of the Auckland Museum. At first, I felt a sense of silent camaraderie with the larvally soft-skinned habitués of the research library, each secreted within his, for their vestigial genitalia beneath sexless knitted exteriors were invariably male, cocoon of flannel and paper, jaws working to dissolve sweets from clandestine bags secreted in coat or trouser pocket, like the preening mandibles of the mantids and centipedes they studied. For a single hour each afternoon, a single high window admitted a blade of sunlight into the dim basement room, sending each inhabitant a touch scurrying to a safely engloomed booth. But that fraternal sense soured to a mixture of pity and contempt when the superficiality of their commitment was disgracefully exposed. I had noticed a gentleman withdrawing a copy of Auguste Cladet's Mundus Fabulae, a fascinating book that illuminates the method of staccato clicks that certain bees in the African Xylotrupes family use to communicate with each other by the percussion of their ridged rear legs against the brightly coloured wing casings. Purely by coincidence, I had challenged myself to learn the basic language units of shell percussion, which is akin in principle to Morse code. When he got up and made his way to the restroom, I followed, permitting myself a small secret smile in advance of his presumed delight at my mastery of this obscure language. I entered behind him and waited at a polite distance as he squared up to the urinal. Then, using my heavy signet ring as a four-legged substitute, and the heavy porcelain wash basin as a mock carapace, I sounded out the rhythm for the Zarian side scuttling Beatles version of "Hello." He froze, presumably in recognition, his stream trickling to silence. Encouraged, I ventured a modest joke by tapping "Nestmate or foe?" His head swiveled slowly until his eyes met mine. I smiled and nodded encouragingly, indicating with an extended hand that he should join in the jest, only to step backwards in astonishment as he rushed past me to the door. As I pondered his strange behaviour, he re-entered, accompanied by the elderly librarian, who viewed each withdrawal as a matter of personal offence. The altercation that ensued was a farce. The librarian ventured that this sort of behaviour was not permitted at a place of higher learning. I responded, perhaps overly aggressively, I must admit, given my hurt pride, at what I'd considered a more than passable shell percussion approximation, that the vocabulary for this kind of interaction was limited by necessity. Somehow, the overlapping voices and gesticulations escalated into a struggle, during the course of which my coat was torn open. The compressed limbs of my apparatus sprang forth, and a glinting foreleg whipped across the librarian's cheek. Both men stepped back from me then, the librarian's face pale as drops of blood beaded in his wound. I carefully folded my apparatus, wrapped my coat around myself, and exited the library in wounded silence. Stung by my shabby treatment at the hands of those self-anointed academics, I secluded myself at home and began to excavate the online entomological forums. The most easily accessible layer consisted of predictably superficial prattle. My roses are infested with small, scaly insects that While walking with my wife, I came across a brilliant green beetle whose... The layer below that, a world of dilettantes obsessed with Latin nomenclature. And far below that, in the deepest recesses of the sub-internet, the chthonic level under whose distorting pressure only the true obsessive pokes and squirms, I found myself creating an account at esoterica.subforum.entomophiles. As I browsed the members, I found myself arrested by the profile picture of Scarab Girl 1978. The image was a bisected square. The left side comprised of a magnified view of the iridescent green shell casing of what I assumed was a Pyronota festiva, a native New Zealand beetle of the scarab family, and the right side consisting of the right half of a woman's face, ingeniously augmented with makeup designed to mimic the subtle shimmer of the beetle's wing case. Her profile indicated that she lived in a town only an hour's drive from the city, and that her interests included scarab play and ethno-ento-communion. I was not familiar with either phrase, but was curious enough to send her a short message praising the aesthetic effect of her profile image, and teasingly, but with the serious purpose of determining if she was legitimate, asked if she preferred her thorax ridged or noded. I admit that I felt some trepidation as to whether she would reply. But just as I had resolved to go and work on my biofilms project in the kitchen, the laptop chimed with her response. Ridged? Noded? Both! You have me spinning with excitement. I laughed out loud with delight. She had not only correctly divined the trick nature of my question, the male Pyronota beetle's ridged thorax becomes speckled with nodes as it enters sexual maturity, but had further made droll reference to the clumsy spinning dance that the females employ as a mating cue. A whirlwind of forum messages culminated in a face-to-face meeting at an Auckland restaurant. Arabella, her allegedly real name, was instantly recognizable in an inventive costume of shimmering emerald layers. Another artful play on the beetle's distinctive casing. I had left my improved apparatus at home, having vainly decided that it ruined the cut of my jacket. But when she arrived at the table, I presented her with an orb of carefully woven flowers. She gasped with touched recognition. The gift was inspired by the balls of decaying leaf matter that the male Pyronota crafts for potential mates, and a most successful date ensued. As we lingered over cake and dessert wine, I declared that I had greatly enjoyed our first physical meeting, and inquired as to whether we might repeat it. Flushed from the wine, Arabella said that she would love to do so, and ventured that we might even take it to the next level. I agreed immediately, for although our dealings thus far had been pleasant, and Arabella had greatly impressed me by proving herself even more familiar with the Melalonthidae family than I had expected, our discussions had focused more on her somewhat anthropomorphized appreciations of their appearance and habits, their resemblance to living jewels, their habit of mating vigorously and polyamorously even for insects, etc., and I was eager to graduate to the hard study that I assumed we both had in mind. I inquired as to whether she meant a physical level, picturing us collaborating on the practical work I had been doing at the house regarding pheromone signaling and biofilm nutrition. She flushed deeper and said that I could certainly put it like that. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirrored bar as we got up to leave the restaurant. My blandly handsome face has often seemed somehow contingent to me, as if there might be a series of hidden tabs lining that trustworthy jaw, or a method of depressing in sequence those thoughtful eyes, that might cause the entire facade to split and lift away with no pain, like wing cases parting to reveal the scything mechanics beneath. The superficial fitness for mating indicated by that face's pleasing distribution of fatty deposits under skin, however, is no doubt what induced Arabella, upon my having walked her to her car, to kiss me firmly, her hand fluttering at my thigh, with a salacious comment about my engorged node. Stunned, I drove home and pondered the stroke of good fortune. Not only to have found a potential research partner, but in all likelihood one with whom the possibility of regular mating was achievable. Mother had always maintained that proper hygiene, in terms of satisfaction of one's natural impulses, was to be ignored at one's peril. We had set another date for the following week, this time at my house. Following a meal and a considerable amount of wine, my attempt to show her my diagrams was preempted by her insistence that we dance to a recording of Pyronota clicks that she had loaded onto her phone. Barely had we begun than she moved in close and began fumbling at the buttons of my jacket. "I can't seem to... There's something caught under," she muttered, as the final button slid free of its confounding slit. Her eyes widened as the articulated limbs unfolded on smoothly oiled hinges, the candlelight projecting 8 graceful shadows onto the wall and ceiling. I slid my fingers into the hidden gauntlets, whose nylon fishing lines manipulated the legs via an ingenious system of eyelets attached to tibial spurs. After the unfortunate incident at the library, I had perfected the design by adding rubberized tips to the tarsal claws to avoid accidental gougings. Arabella drew in her breath as I expertly worked my fingers, and my new limbs enfolded her in a gentle embrace. Her eyes flickered, some animal awareness invading the alcohol's sheen. "I think I need a glass of water," she softly said. "Of course," I said. "Through here." I gestured down the hall and opened the cradling arms on that side with a carefully practiced movement. She moved crabwise, pretending playfully, or so I believed at the time, to keep her eyes on me, as if I might pounce once she turned her back. The candlelight in the kitchen barely illuminated the dark floor, so it was not surprising that Arabella failed to appreciate the pale discs that magically appeared around our feet as we entered, and moved with us like patches of charmed moonlight as I followed her to the counter. She poured a glass of water with trembling fingers, eyes darting around the room as her vision adjusted. "Did you put something in my food?" she asked. I stared at her in confusion, then followed her gaze and realized that the kaleidoscopic throb of the wallpaper might seem rather hallucinatory to the uninitiated. I had begun to chuckle at the misunderstanding, only realizing in retrospect that the candlelight had likely pasted my shadow limbs up to the high ceiling in a regrettably sinister fashion. When she looked more closely at the floor and screamed. Before I could protest, she had leaped towards the light switch, landing on the dark carpet with murderous feet. She flicked the switch, and the pale circles expanded as the legions of beetles that had congregated to sample the biofilms I had so carefully applied to the floor and walls, and had maintained a respectful distance from our lumbering feet, fled the spiteful bulb, leaving only those who had met an ignoble end crushed and embedded in Arabella's callous souls. I will not detail the ugly specifics of her exit. After her departure, I finished the bottle of wine and, in a state of bitter inebriation, checked my old work email for the first time since my dismissal at David's hands, having retained administrative privileges he was not aware of. I was about to log off, oddly cheered by the fact that the colony I had helped create was still running so efficiently, when I came across an email from David to another of the partners, from which I gleaned their plan to betray the entry-level shareholders, myself included, by transferring the company's intellectual property to a foreign jurisdiction shell. I opened another bottle. I woke with my cheek broiling in the sunrise through the kitchen window, the fizzing throb in my head resolving into a trapped fly droning against the window. It occurred to me, watching it thrust against the invisible obstruction, that the obtuse intentions of my species, David's betrayal, the spiteful creatures at the museum, Arabella's hollow gloss, constituted a veiled barrier against which I had battered myself all my life. I relaxed my eyes until the kitchen's reflection in the glass superimposed itself on the garden, 2 paths laid before me. I suddenly realized what, despite my fascination with that lattice of soil and branch, I had failed to comprehend. That the empire beyond the glass was a realm of violence without cruelty, of killing power without degradation, of orgiastic fecundity without shame. The revelation of a new world had been offered, and I had debased it as a tool for approximating human experience, blind to the opportunity of true communion. A memory lurched forth. As a child, I'd been intrigued by the idea of metamorphosis, after learning that when the caterpillar enters its cocoon, it does not morph into a new shape, but rather liquefies into a cellular soup that then constitutes itself into the new stage. I remember asking my mother whether it hurt the caterpillar, and her, following that curious tick of hers whereby she would stare at me for a moment as if I were a stranger in her house, before configuring her expression into a careful smile, baring her teeth and assuring me that it did not. Unable to self-weave a cocoon, I set about dismantling the rear of the house so as to more fully integrate with my environment, leaving the facade intact in order to avoid undue attention. I reframed my diet through force of will, lapping dew from the morning leaves and preying on skittering protein morsels. My stomach rebelled at first. I spent one writhing afternoon after consuming an innocuous-seeming shield beetle, glad of the sound-cancelling effect that reserved my weeping moans for the garden's private consumption, but soon adjusted. The house had become chill at night since the power was cut off, and the honeycombed roof transformed my mattress into an eruption of fungal scallops with the first rain. But it was more the insect's wariness of spaces wide enough for swooping wings that soon led me to burrow into the compost pile at sunset, seeking the energy radiated by anaerobic organisms breaking down dead matter. Thus it was that on a still dawn I emerged from that pungent womb with my body perfected, my frame grown leaner, senses finer, soft skin scarified into a leathery carapace. My only concern was that I had been unable, as yet, to shed the entanglements of the human mind, the hurt, the fantasies of revenge, and feared that I would remain trapped within this psychological coil like a larva too weak to split its cocoon. Then came the fateful knock. It had been so long since I had interacted with the outside world that I thought at first I had imagined it, and remained frozen until it repeated. I made my way through the house's new geometry to the front door, so swollen by the moisture admitted by my renovations that the lock no longer engaged. The shape behind the glass shifted at my approach. "Carl," said a voice. "It's David." I did not respond. "Would you please open the door? I can see you through the glass." I panicked and scuttled backwards up the stairs, crouching in the kitchen doorway. The shape shifted. "Come on, Carl, don't do this. I just need 2 minutes." Another knock, and the door jutted free of the swollen jam. David stepped over the lintel, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. When he saw my face at the top of the stairs, he took a step back, and then laughed. "Jesus, you gave me a fright." He flicked an unresponsive light switch. "What the hell is... It's freezing in here. I'm coming up, okay?" I retreated through the kitchen as the warped stairs creaked with his weight, sliding instinctively behind one of the rotting curtains, like an earwig behind a decaying leaf. He entered the kitchen, his expression momentarily slipping a cog at the sight of my pale face floating at the edge of the curtain, before calibrating into a friendly smile. "Look, I've clearly caught you at a bad time." He pulled a sheaf of paper out of his jacket pocket. "I just need this document signed. It's about your severance package. I felt bad about how we let you go, so I wanted to make it up to you." He began to move slowly towards me, as if on a tightrope. "I think you'll find it's very generous." I knew, of course, from the intercepted emails that the document would contain an improved severance payment, along with an IP assignment clause tucked in the fine print, allowing him and his co-conspirator to transfer the value of the company. This was the moment I had simultaneously feared and craved, the imagined confrontation that had obsessed me each night as I twisted in my hot slot. As the ragged curtains compressed the sunrise into sluggish butter, David held a hand out towards me, in a gesture both calming and warding, and a ring on his finger flashed in the sullen light. Something seemed to slide and click behind my eyes, and I felt in that instant that my brain had liquefied in its bone cocoon and been made anew, dull grey coral replaced with a smooth iridescent sheen. There was joy in that migration of the mind, and I threw back my head and emitted a mushy hoot. David's face tightened, the true wires under his skin teasing a snarl from the feigned smile. "Are you laughing at me? You... He stepped forward and ripped the curtain aside with one hand, the other raised to strike. But something revealed in the flooding light, perhaps my nakedness, my clothes having been offered to moths and other fibrophiles. Perhaps the empty cave of my gums, my teeth, having contributed their calcium for precious nest-bonding pastes. Perhaps my twitching jigsaw of helpers, tirelessly buffing away dead cells and parasites, made him freeze and jerk away, as if our polarities had suddenly reversed. He instinctively flung open the door to his side that had previously led to the upstairs hallway, ignoring my warning cry, eyes wide over his shoulder as he darted into a void. I leaned forward with my hand on the door frame and peered down through the lattice of framing timber and wallpaper shreds, all that remained of the rear half of the house following the ministrations of 1,000 mandibles, at David's body lying at the edge of the garden, his sparse limbs twitching. I climbed down through the joists and landed on the ground with a heavy spider's plump thump. David croaked entreaties, threats, enticements of splitting the fruits of his deception, all accompanied by the whistling labour of what I assume was a pierced lung. But I could not save him, for the amber flash of his ring had echoed a withdrawn sting, a globe of yellow ichor gleaming at its tip. Of a wasp I had seen struggling with a praying mantis in the western reaches of the garden beyond Big Log. The paralyzed mantis would become a living larder to be consumed and discarded, and with that spark I had instinctively seen David for what he was, the wasp in a corporate nest, piggybacking on the flesh and energy of others, and my fantasies of revenge had evaporated. An ant would have no concept of cruelty, of punishment or torture. There was only the clean solution of removal of the parasite. As my new colleagues approached the raving cave with its precious salivary springs, it seemed a greater mercy not to warn him to close his mouth. Soon all noise and movement ceased, save for the rustles and clicks of an army of engineers gauging the extent of its windfall. Although I doubted anything could be proved either way, and the authorities might even conclude that it was my body that lay there, once my brethren's work was complete. I could not risk the interruption of my learnings that an investigation would entail. I spent the rest of the day harvesting eggs and queens, gathering substrates and exhuming camping gear. By sunset, the Range Rover had been transformed into a loam-scented incubator. I looked up at the windows of the house, plastered with dying clouds, and thought of the afternoon of David's call, the dipping spray of flowers that had led me down to myself. I started the ignition. The GPS screen blinked on, a crooked red line leading to a mass of pure green, a world of freedom to experiment in peace. As the car's suspension thunked over the curb, a wave of pinpricks percussed my skin, causing the surface of my coat to ripple as countless legs realigned for balance. I shivered with pride. I was the pillar of regurgitated earth on an ochre plain. I was the constellation of papery chambers beneath a sheltering eave. Their limbs clutched me tight, and I was finally loved.
The horror in this story is not about the insects, but identity. Carl suffers a job setback. Like a lot of people, he defines himself through his career, so his identity is threatened. Like a lot of people, he retreats to childhood pursuits for some comfort and stability. And unfortunately, like a lot of people, he doesn't pursue this interest to expand his horizons or connect with other people. He uses it to bolster his wounded ego. He constructs a cocoon of knowledge ostensibly for protection, but it's really for isolation. He thinks he's making attempts to connect, but his actions say otherwise. Is he that socially inept not to think approaching a guy peeing in a public bathroom or not telling your date that your house is a giant terrarium are bad ideas? Whether he knows it or not, this is part of his transformation. Connection, love, and mercy have no room in his cocoon. Unlike insects who become more when they emerge, Carl is less. What emerges isn't human. That's the horror. Now is the time to bother you for money. See? Still not going to say bug you. Like a hive that converts the pollen brought in by the drones to sweet honey, we convert the money brought in by our listeners to sweet audio content. Unlike that hive, we don't treat you as mere drones. If you subscribe $5 a month on Patreon, you get access to all sorts of audio goodies, including Cat's Cast, our new monthly Patreon-exclusive podcast featuring stories about cats. Yes, our April Fool's joke is now an actual podcast. Go figure. If you want something a bit more physical, we have clothing and such at Void Merch. You can go to voidmerch.threadless.com and hit the collection tab, and there we are. Get something nice to wear and advertise us. It's a win-win. PseudoPod is part of Escape Artists Incorporated and is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Theme music is by permission of Angler's Manga. This week's quote is from Pink Floyd. Hum along if you know the tune. Don't think I need anything at all. No, don't think I'll need anything at all. All in all, it was all just bricks in the wall. All in all, you were all just bricks in the wall. See you next week.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.